Paul Stan's pen was seconds from touching the contract when the waitress leaned close and whispered, "Your translator is lying." The room didn't explode with shouting worse. It went completely silent. Because if she was right, the man Paul trusted most in the room was about to sign away his entire empire. If this story pulled you in, go ahead and subscribe so you never miss what's ahead. I've got another unforgettable story coming tomorrow. And while you're here, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing people tuned in from all over the world. Okay, let's get back into it. A lie does not always arrive with a raised voice or a shifting eye. Sometimes it comes dressed in precision, spoken softly, translated cleanly, and handed across a table as though it were the truth all along. In the gilded hush of the Meridian's private dining suite, where old money moved in silence and chandeliers hung low enough to feel like judgment, a deal was being made, and somewhere inside it, molecule by molecule, a betrayal was already breathing. Nancy Moore moved between the table settings the way water moves through stone, without announcement, without resistance. Her white shirt was pressed to a fault. Her dark vest absorbed the low amber light. To the men at the table, she was a pair of careful hands, a tilted decanter, a presence designed to serve and then dissolve. No one looked at her the way you look at someone who matters. That was exactly why she was dangerous tonight. She had worked the Meridian's private floor for 2 years. Long enough to understand its particular silence, the kind that only exists when powerful men have agreed, without words, that certain conversations will never leave the room. Long enough to recognize, without being told, that tonight's booking was not a celebration, it was a transaction. The kind measured not in courses, but in consequences. The suite held one long mahogany table. Dark wood paneling absorbed the chandelier's warm glow. White plates sat untouched. Crystal glasses caught the light like held breath. 3 men occupied the far end of the table, and the weight of what they were doing pressed down on the room like weather. At the center sat Paul Stan. She had served him before. She knew what he was, not from the whispers that circulated among the staff, though there were plenty of those, but from the quality of his stillness. A man who has never been the most frightened person in any room he has entered holds himself differently. Paul Stan held himself like a locked door. His black suit jacket lay smooth across shoulders built for consequence. The collar of his black shirt sat open at the throat, where the edge of a tattoo rose just above the fabric. More ink mapped across both hands, dark, deliberate markings that stopped at his wrists, with the precision of a man who had chosen exactly how much of himself to display. His short hair was neat, his jaw was set. Before him on the table lay an open contract, several pages thick, and his right hand held a pen that hovered just above the signature line. He was close to signing. Across from him sat Mr. Lee, older, composed. His gray suit was immaculate, his burgundy tie knotted with quiet authority. He sat with the particular patience of a man who had traveled a great distance and fully intended to leave with what he had come for. His hands rested flat on the table, still as stone. His eyes moved slowly, carefully, the way a man's eyes move when he has learned that rooms like this one reward attention. Between them, not seated, but positioned, stood Victor Hale. Nancy knew him by reputation more than presence. Polished, unhurried. His Mandarin rolled out like silk from a sleeve, effortless and convincing, the kind of fluency that makes everyone in earshot relax their shoulders. He was the bridge, the trusted one. Paul Stan had brought him to every overseas negotiation for years. When Victor spoke, Paul listened without looking up, with the complete and unconditional attention of a man who has decided, long ago, that trust is the same as certainty. Nancy approached the table from the left. Her job was the wine. She lifted the decanter, dark red, expensive, already opened and breathing, and began to fill Paul Stan's glass. She moved carefully, unhurried, the way she had been trained, and then she heard it. Mr. Lee spoke. His Mandarin came out measured and firm, the tone of a man setting a boundary rather than making a request. Nancy did not catch every word. She had never been fluent, had never claimed to be, but certain phrases landed with a clarity she could not dismiss. Her father's voice was somewhere behind them, patient and low, the way he had always sounded when he was teaching her something he believed she needed to know. This condition is not flexible. She heard it, clearly, unmistakably. Victor did not pause. His English came out smooth and immediate. Mr. Lee says he is hopeful this particular term can be worked around. Nancy's hand steadied on the decanter. She told herself her Mandarin was imperfect. She told herself 2 years of neglect had blurred the edges of whatever her father had given her. She told herself a professional translator, A man Paul Stan had trusted for years could not be doing what she thought she had just heard. She moved to the next glass. Mr. Lee spoke again. This time the phrase was shorter, harder, the kind of sentence that does not require fluency to decode because the tone alone carries the meaning. Nancy's chest recognized it before her mind did. If this agreement fails, everything stops. Victor translated without blinking. He says there may be some room for flexibility if complications arise. Nancy set the decanter down. She did not look at Victor. She did not look at Mr. Lee. She looked at Paul Stan's hand, the tattoos across his knuckles, the pen between his fingers, the contract beneath it. He was nodding slowly. The nod of a man who is satisfied. The nod of a man who is about to sign. He had not heard what she heard. He had no reason to doubt the words being handed to him. Nancy took one step back from the table. Her expression gave nothing away. Her hands were steady. Behind her ribs, however, something had shifted, something that felt uncomfortably like the moment before a decision, when the body already knows what the mind has not yet admitted. She was not fluent. She could not be certain. But she had been taught, by a man who believed language was the most honest thing a person could carry, to trust the moment when words and meaning stopped matching. And those words did not match. She looked at the contract. She looked at the pen. She picked up the decanter, and she went back to the table. Some memories do not live in the mind. They live in the body, in the hands, in the throat, in the particular way a familiar sound moves through the chest before the brain has time to name it. Nancy Moore had not thought about her father's Mandarin lessons in years. Not deliberately, not with any intention of returning to them. But memory, she was learning, does not ask permission before it comes home. She stood just inside the kitchen pass, her back to the dining room, the decanter still in her hand. The sounds of the suite filtered through the door behind her, the low exchange of voices, the soft scrape of a pen, the occasional clink of crystal. Ordinary sounds, the sounds of business being conducted over good wine in an expensive room. Except she knew, now, that not everything in that room was what it sounded like. She set the decanter on the counter and pressed her fingertips flat against the cool steel surface. Shanghai, the word arrived without invitation. And with it, everything attached to it. Her father's name was Robert Moore, and he had spent 11 years working cargo logistics along the Shanghai port routes before Nancy was old enough to understand what that meant. By the time she was 7, he had already returned thinner, quieter, with a duffel bag full of worn clothes and a language folded into him like a second skeleton. Mandarin. Not textbook Mandarin. Not classroom Mandarin. The real kind dock worker Mandarin, negotiation Mandarin, the kind you learn when every miscommunication costs money and every clearly spoken word saves it. He never made a lesson of it. That was the thing she remembered most. He never sat her down with flashcards or a notebook. He simply spoke it, here and there, woven into ordinary days. He would name things around the house. He would repeat a phrase until she repeated it back correctly. He corrected her pronunciation with the patient precision of a man who understood that tone was everything, that the same syllable, spoken differently, could mean generosity or insult, agreement or refusal. Tone is the truth, he used to say. When the words confuse you, listen to the tone. She had been 12 when he started teaching her the business phrases. Not because he believed she would ever need them, but because he was proud of what he had learned, and sharing it was the closest he could come to taking her with him to the place that had shaped him. This is non-negotiable. She remembered how he made her practice that one for an entire afternoon. The terms must be honored. He tapped the table with one finger when he said it a habit, she realized now, that Mr. Lee had echoed tonight without knowing it. If the agreement fails, everything stops. He had said that one grimly, from experience. The tone of a man who had watched a deal collapse and understood exactly what followed. Nancy closed her eyes in the kitchen pass. She heard those phrases again. Not from memory from the room behind her, from Mr. Lee's mouth, from the conversation she had no business listening to and could not stop hearing. And then she heard Victor's translations laid over them like a sheet pulled over something you do not want to look at. She had not misheard. Her father had died 4 years ago. A Tuesday in February, unremarkable weather, a hospital room that smelled like recycled air, and the particular hopelessness of fluorescent lighting. He had gone quietly, the way he had lived most of his life without requiring an audience for the difficult parts. Nancy had held his hand for the last 6 hours. She had not spoken much. Neither had he. There had been a moment near the end when he had said something in Mandarin, low and private, The way you speak when you are talking to yourself and have simply forgotten that someone else is present. She had understood every word. She had not told anyone that. Not then. Not since. It was the last thing he ever gave her, those words. In that language. In that particular tone that could only mean one thing. She had carried them the way you carry something fragile across a long distance. Carefully. Without looking down. Trusting your hands to hold what your eyes cannot afford to watch. She had not expected the language to follow her here. The kitchen door swung open, and a colleague moved past her with a tray, glancing sideways. "You all right?" "Fine," Nancy said. "Just needed a moment." He moved on. The door swung closed. She picked up the decanter. She told herself, one final time, that she could be wrong. That 2 years on a Shanghai dock does not make a linguist. That a handful of childhood phrases absorbed across a kitchen table does not qualify her to challenge a man who translates professionally, who has built a career on the precision of language, who has been trusted by one of the most dangerous men in this city for years. She told herself all of this, and then she thought about tone. Tone is the truth. Her father's voice. Patient. Certain. The voice of a man who had learned the hard way that the most expensive thing in any negotiation is a misunderstood sentence. Mr. Lee's tone had not been flexible. Mr. Lee's tone had not been hopeful or accommodating or open to interpretation. Mr. Lee's tone had been the tone of a man drawing a line in the ground and waiting to see if the person across from him understood what it meant. Victor had handed Paul Stan something else entirely, and Paul Stan, pen in hand, contract beneath it, had accepted it without question, because he trusted Victor. Because why would he not? Nancy stood very still for one moment longer. She thought about trust, about what it costs a man like Paul Stan to extend it, and what it costs him when it is quietly turned against him in a room full of expensive wine and careful words. She thought about what her father would have done. She already knew the answer. She pushed through the kitchen door, decanter in hand, and walked back toward the table. There is a particular kind of silence that exists only in rooms where large amounts of money are about to change hands. It is not empty silence. It is loaded silence, the kind that hums beneath polished surfaces and measured voices, invisible but present, the way electricity runs through walls without ever being seen. Nancy had worked the Meridian's private floor long enough to recognize it. She had simply never been standing inside it before, listening for something specific. She returned to her station at the side of the room, close enough to serve, far enough to be forgotten. The conversation had resumed. Victor stood between the two men with the relaxed authority of someone who has occupied this position many times, the indispensable center, the necessary bridge, the one without whom nothing moves. He gestured occasionally as he spoke, unhurried, his voice modulated to project calm competence. Paul Stan sat back slightly in his chair now, the pen resting between two fingers. Mr. Lee had produced a second document thinner, folded once and laid it beside the original contract. Nancy watched Victor's hands as he spoke. She did not know why. Something about the way he held them palms slightly outward when translating into English, closed loosely at his sides, when translating into Mandarin, made her feel as though she were watching a performance that had been rehearsed until the seams no longer showed. She lifted a water glass from the adjacent setting and moved toward the table. The deal, as far as Nancy had been able to piece together across the evening, was substantial. Paul Stan's shipping network, the legitimate face of it, at least operated across several continents. Cargo routes, port contracts, freight arrangements that moved goods from one side of the world to the other with the efficiency of a machine built by someone who understood that time, in this business, was simply money in a different form. Mr. Lee represented the eastern half of that equation. His companies controlled 3 major port routes along the Chinese coastline, routes that, if aligned with Paul Stan's existing network, would create something considerably larger than either man currently operated alone. The contract on the table was the mechanism for that alignment, pages of terms, obligations, penalties, and protections that would bind both men to an agreement neither could easily exit once signed. Nancy understood enough of that to understand the stakes. What she understood more clearly now was the specific way Victor was adjusting them. Mr. Lee spoke again. His voice was precise, unhurried, carrying the weight of a man who had reviewed these terms many times and arrived tonight with no intention of softening them. Nancy heard it. The financial penalties are fixed. They cannot be altered after signing. She kept her face composed, refilled the water glass, did not look at Victor directly. Victor translated. Mr. Lee notes that the penalty structure is something he'd like to revisit together if needed post-signing. Paul Stan nodded, made a small note in the margin of the contract. Nancy set the water pitcher down carefully. Revisit together if needed. She turned the phrase over in her mind, holding it against what she had heard. What Mr. Lee had said was not an invitation. It was a wall. A clearly constructed, deliberately worded wall that told the man across the table exactly what he was agreeing to carry if things went wrong. Victor had turned the wall into a door. She moved back to her station. The pattern, now that she was looking for it, was not subtle. It was only invisible if you were not listening in both directions simultaneously, which, she understood, was precisely the condition Victor was counting on. Paul Stan spoke no Mandarin. Mr. Lee's English was limited to pleasantries. The space between them belonged entirely to Victor. And Victor was filling it with something carefully, deliberately different from what was being said. Strict became flexible. Fixed became negotiable. Non-negotiable became open to discussion. Each alteration, taken alone, might seem minor. A softened adjective, a shifted emphasis, a clause reframed as a suggestion rather than a condition. But Nancy had watched her father work contracts long enough to understand that deals are not broken by dramatic betrayals. They are broken by the slow accumulation of small misunderstandings that only reveal themselves when it is far too late to go back to the table. By the time Paul Stan discovered what he had actually signed, the signatures would be ink and the terms would be law. Mr. Lee leaned forward now, both hands flat on the table, and spoke at slightly greater length. His tone shifted, still controlled, but carrying something underneath it that Nancy recognized as urgency. The kind that a measured man allows himself only when he believes the person across from him is not yet fully understanding what is being offered. She listened carefully. This partnership protects both parties only if the obligations are honored completely. If one side fails to meet the terms, the consequences are immediate and total. There is no grace period. This was agreed in the preliminary correspondence. It was the longest statement Mr. Lee had made all evening. Victor let a brief, professional pause follow it, the pause of a man who is translating something complex and wants to appear thorough. Then he spoke. Mr. Lee wants to emphasize how much he values the spirit of mutual cooperation here. He sees this as a long-term relationship built on goodwill, and he's confident both parties will find the terms straightforward. Paul Stan looked up from the contract for the first time in several minutes. He met Mr. Lee's eyes across the table. Mr. Lee held his gaze steadily, waiting, with the expression of a man who has just said something important and is watching to see whether it has landed correctly. It had not landed at all. Paul Stan smiled brief, controlled, and looked back down at the contract. "Tell him I appreciate that," he said to Victor. "We're almost there." Nancy stood at her station and felt something cold move through her chest. Almost there. The pen was back in Paul Stan's hand. The contract was open to the final page. Outside the suite, the rest of the restaurant continued its ordinary evening glasses clinking, low laughter, the sound of a world that did not know what was happening in this room. Nancy looked at the signature line. She looked at the pen. She thought, almost there. And she thought, not yet. There are moments in a person's life that do not announce themselves as turning points. They arrive dressed as ordinary evenings, a shift that runs long, a table that stays late, a conversation you were never meant to hear. You only understand what they were later, when you are looking back at them from a distance and can finally see the shape of what happened. Nancy understood that tonight was one of those moments. She stood at her station with the decanter in her hand and watched Paul Stan's pen hover above the contract's final page, and she felt the specific weight of a decision that had not yet been made, pressing down on her from both sides simultaneously. The weight of speaking, the weight of silence, both were heavy. Only one was something she could live with. But before she understood why, she had to go back. 2 years ago, on a Thursday in November, Nancy Moore's life had come apart without warning. Her mother had collapsed at home, a rupture, swift and catastrophic, the kind that does not give you time to prepare or negotiate. The ambulance arrived quickly, the hospital less so. By the time Nancy reached the emergency ward, breathless from running 3 blocks in the wrong shoes, her mother was already behind doors she was not permitted to pass through, and a woman at the admissions desk was explaining, with the practiced sympathy of someone who has delivered this particular news many times, that treatment authorization required a financial guarantee. The number she was given was not possible. Nancy had savings, the careful, modest savings of someone who had been building toward something without being entirely sure what. They did not cover a third of what was needed. Her mother had no insurance that applied. Her father was 4 years gone. There was no one else. She remembered standing in that corridor with her phone in her hand, cycling through contacts the way a drowning person cycles through options, not because any of them are good, but because the alternative to trying is unthinkable. She called 3 people, left 2 voicemails, heard one genuine apology from someone who meant it, but could not help. She was sitting on a bench outside the admissions office. Not crying, she was past crying. She had reached the flat, gray country on the other side of crying when the Meridian's floor manager appeared beside her. She had not expected him. He had not explained how he knew where she was. He simply sat down, told her quietly that arrangements had been made, and handed her a folded piece of paper with a reference number on it. When she asked who, he shook his head once, gently, with the expression of someone delivering a message they have been asked not to elaborate on. She had known, even then. Paul Stan had been a regular at the Meridian for years, not conspicuous about it. He did not require ceremony or preferential treatment, or rather, he required it so completely that it had ceased to be noticeable. He came, he dined, he conducted whatever quiet business brought him there, and he left. The staff knew him, not personally, but enough. Enough to know that he had overheard, through some chain of information she never fully traced, the conversation Nancy had with the floor manager on the night her mother was admitted. Enough to know that he had made a call, signed something, sent someone. He had never mentioned it. Not that night, not the following week when he returned to the Meridian, and Nancy served his table with hands that shook slightly from exhaustion and relief. Not once in the 2 years since. He had looked at her the way he always looked at the staff acknowledgement without intimacy, the nod of a man who expected competence and received it, and that was all. No expectation, no leverage, no quiet reminder of what he had done. Just the act itself, clean and complete, dropped into the worst night of her life without fanfare. Her mother had recovered. Fully, eventually, slowly. She was alive. She was home. She was currently, at this moment, in an apartment 12 minutes from the Meridian, watching something on television and entirely unaware that her daughter was standing in a private dining suite, trying to decide whether to insert herself into a dangerous man's business dealings. Nancy thought about that apartment, that television, that ordinary, irreplaceable Thursday evening. None of it existed without what Paul Stan had done. She looked at him now across the room, the tattoos across his hands, the controlled set of his jaw, the pen moving slowly toward the paper as Victor spoke in smooth, unhurried English about goodwill and long-term relationships in terms that were, in fact, none of those things. Paul Stan was not a good man. She held no illusions about that. The world he occupied was not one she would defend or excuse or look away from under ordinary circumstances. The business conducted in rooms like this one, at tables like this one, was not the kind that appeared in public records or resolved itself through courts. She knew what he was. She also knew what he had done for her. Not because she was useful to him, not because there was anything to gain, not because the gesture would ever be acknowledged or repaid or even mentioned in daylight. He had done it because she was a person in a corridor who had nowhere left to turn. That was the thing she could not get around. That was the weight on the other side of the scale. Not obligation exactly, not debt in the transactional sense. Something older and simpler than that. The thing her father would have named immediately, and without hesitation. You owe him the truth, not because he is powerful, not because he is dangerous, not because staying silent might be noticed and remaining unseen is safer. Because someone who acts with that kind of quiet decency even once, even in a life otherwise built on harder things, deserves to know when the person beside him is lying. Nancy set the decanter down on the side table. She straightened her vest. She smoothed the front of her shirt. She looked at the contract beneath Paul Stan's pen. Almost there, he had said. Not yet, she thought. Not if she could help it. She picked up the decanter and walked toward the table. She was 4 steps from the table when Victor's phone vibrated. It was a small thing, barely audible beneath the ambient warmth of the dining room. But Victor heard it. She saw the slight shift in his posture, the almost imperceptible tightening of the hand at his side, and he excused himself with the polished ease of a man who has rehearsed even his interruptions. "One moment," he said to Paul Stan. Then to Mr. Lee, in Mandarin, something Nancy caught only partially an apology, brief and formal. He stepped away from the table and moved toward the far end of the suite, near the heavy curtained alcove that separated the private dining room from the corridor beyond. Nancy stopped at the side table. She set the decanter down slowly. She did not follow him. She did not need to. The alcove was 12 feet away, and the suite, for all its grandeur, was not built for secrets spoken above a murmur. Victor's voice was low, controlled. The voice of a man maintaining composure for the benefit of whoever was watching, which, in that moment, he believed was no one. He was wrong. She caught it in fragments. Not all of it. Enough. The language shifted. Not Mandarin. Not the careful English he used for the table. Something faster. Stripped of the professional polish. The way people speak when they believe the performance is temporarily suspended and only the real conversation remains. She heard a name, not Paul Stan's, but a title. The Network. She heard it twice, in the same flat tone you use for something you have already decided to dismantle. She heard, the clauses activate automatically. She heard a pause, his end listening, the other end speaking, and then, once he signs, it moves without him. Another pause. Shorter. He won't understand what he agreed to until it's already done. Nancy did not move. She stood with one hand resting on the side table, her weight perfectly distributed, her face holding the expression she had spent 2 years perfecting the look of a person who is present, without being anywhere in particular, whose thoughts are entirely occupied with the next table setting or the temperature of the wine. Inside, something had gone very cold and very clear. She had suspected mistranslation. That alone had been enough to stop her breath twice in the last 40 minutes. This was different. Mistranslation could have been carelessness, could have been bias, could have been the ordinary human tendency to smooth rough edges when moving words between worlds, to soften what feels harsh, to simplify what feels complex. She had considered all of those possibilities and held them carefully against what she had heard, testing each one, because the alternative, the intentional alternative, was not something she had wanted to arrive at without evidence. She had evidence now. Once he signs, it moves without him. Not carelessness, not simplification. A plan. A deliberate, constructed plan that required Paul Stan's signature on a document he did not actually understand, containing terms he had not actually been given, built around a translation that had been engineered from the beginning to produce exactly this moment, a man with a pen in his hand, and no idea what he was holding. Victor returned to the table 2 minutes later. He slipped his phone into his jacket pocket and resumed his position between the two men, with the seamless ease of someone stepping back into a role they have never truly left. He said something to Mr. Lee in Mandarin brief, reassuring. Mr. Lee nodded once, with the small, controlled satisfaction of a man receiving confirmation of something he already knew. Nancy watched that nod. She filed it away. She thought about what she now understood. The contract on the table was not what Paul Stan believed it to be. The terms Victor had been translating softened, adjusted, made to appear flexible and mutual and built on goodwill, were not the terms Mr. Lee had brought to this table. The real terms were underneath them, buried in the precise legal language of a document Paul Stan could not read in its original form, dressed in the friendly approximations Victor had provided as translation. Hidden clauses, automatic penalties, obligations that would trigger without warning, without grace period, without any mechanism for negotiation once the ink was dry. The financial penalties are fixed. They cannot be altered after signing. She heard Mr. Lee's voice again in her memory, the urgency beneath the control, the careful emphasis of a man who believed, in that moment, that he was issuing a warning. He had not been issuing a warning to trap Paul Stan. He had been issuing a warning because he did not know Victor was burying it. The understanding landed with the particular force of something that rearranges what came before it. Mr. Lee was not the architect of the betrayal. Victor was. She stood very still with this knowledge and felt it settle into the full shape of what it was. Victor Hale, the trusted one, the indispensable bridge, the man Paul Stan had brought into rooms like this one for years because he believed loyalty was the one currency that did not depreciate. He had quietly aligned himself with parties connected to this deal, who stood to profit enormously from Paul Stan's financial collapse. The plan was elegant in the way that truly dangerous plans are elegant, built on something undetectable, not violence, not theft, not any mechanism that leaves evidence in the conventional sense. Just language, just the invisible space between what one man says and what another man hears, manipulated by the one person in the room trusted to keep that space honest. If the contract was signed tonight, the penalties would activate on a timeline Paul Stan could not predict and could not prevent. His shipping network, built across years, across continents, across every careful and ruthless decision that had brought him to this table, would begin to collapse from the inside, and Victor would be gone before the walls came down. Nancy looked across the room. Paul Stan's pen was moving again. Mr. Lee sat with that same composed patience. Victor stood between them, polished and unhurried, his hands loosely open. She was the only person in this room who knew all of it. She was a waitress with a decanter and a dead man's language lessons, and 2 years of careful invisibility, and she was, Without question, the only thing standing between Paul Stan and everything he was about to lose. She picked up the decanter. She walked toward the table. There is a moment before every irreversible action where time does something strange. It does not slow, exactly. It sharpens. The edges of things become very clear, the grain of the wood beneath your fingertips, the exact temperature of the glass in your hand, the precise distance between where you are standing and where everything changes. Nancy had experienced that sharpening once before, in a hospital corridor, when she understood that the next thing she did would determine what came after it for a very long time. She was experiencing it again now. She stopped 2 tables short of the private suite's entrance and stood with the decanter at her side and let herself, for exactly 1 moment, think clearly about what she was considering. She was considering warning a Mafia boss. Not a difficult client, not an irritable regular with strong opinions about wine temperature. A man whose name, spoken in certain circles, produced a particular quality of silence. A man whose shipping empire was the legitimate surface of an operation that extended into depths she had never wanted to know and had specifically avoided learning. A man who was, by any reasonable measure, not someone a Meridian waitress, inserted herself beside uninvited. She knew all of this. She stood with it. She thought about what happened if she said nothing. The contract would be signed tonight. Victor would complete his translation of the final clauses, softened, adjusted, stripped of their actual weight, and Paul Stan would put his name at the bottom of the page, with the confidence of a man who believed he understood what he was agreeing to. Mr. Lee would sign beneath him. Hands would be shaken. Wine would be finished. The evening would close the way these evenings always closed, quietly, completely, with the polished efficiency of a transaction conducted among men who understand that discretion is simply professionalism by another name. And then, weeks from now, or months, she did not know the timeline the clauses would activate. The penalties would begin. Automatic. Fixed. Non-negotiable. Exactly as Mr. Lee had said at this very table. In a sentence Victor had buried so completely that Paul Stan had nodded and smiled and made a note in the margin. She tried to construct, in her mind, the shape of what followed. Financial penalties at a scale that could destabilize a shipping network operating across multiple continents. Obligations Paul Stan had technically agreed to and could not dispute, because the signature was his, and the contract was legal, and the translator was trusted. Routes collapsing, partners withdrawing. The structural weight of an empire shifting onto foundations that had been quietly removed, without anyone noticing. Victor walking away before the first wall fell. Paul Stan left inside a building he no longer understood. She thought about the hospital corridor again. The woman at the admissions desk. The number that was not possible. She thought about her mother's apartment 12 minutes from here, the television, the ordinary evening. The life that continued because someone had made a phone call and signed something, and never once mentioned it again. She put those 2 things side by side, the silence she was considering, and the silence he had chosen. She thought about what happened if she spoke. This was the harder calculation. Not because the outcome for Paul Stan was worse, it was obviously better. If he believed her, if he acted, if the warning landed the way she needed it to land, but because of everything surrounding that outcome, because of the geometry of what she was inserting herself into. She was not naive about what Paul Stan's world contained. She had worked the Meridian's private floor for 2 years. She had served dinners that were not about food, and meetings that were not about business, and negotiations that had nothing to do with the contracts visible on the table. She had learned, gradually and without being taught explicitly, that the price of working in rooms like this one was understanding clearly where her role ended. Her role ended at the table's edge. Whatever happened beyond it, the deals, the decisions, the men and their arrangements, was not her concern, and was not, under any circumstances, something she was equipped to involve herself in, except that she was already involved, not by choice, not by design, but by the particular accident of a dead man's language lessons and a phone call she had not been meant to overhear, and a pattern of mistranslation she could not unhear, no matter how carefully she had tried. She was already inside it. The only question was whether she acknowledged that or pretended otherwise. She thought about fear. She gave it its full due, did not minimize it or dress it in courage it had not earned. She was afraid. Genuinely, physically afraid, in the way that manifests not as trembling, but as a heightened awareness of every exit in a room, every face, every hand. She was afraid of what Paul Stan might do if he did not believe her. She was afraid of what Victor might do if he understood what had happened. She was afraid of the broader machinery she had glimpsed through the alcove curtain, the other parties, the connected interests. The people for whom this plan was an investment that was now approximately one signature away from beginning to pay out. She held the fear. She did not put it down, but she thought about her father. Not the lessons, not the language. Something simpler than that. The man himself, the way he had moved through the world with the particular unhurried decency of someone who had decided, somewhere along the way, that knowing the right thing and doing the right thing were not two different skills but one. When the words confuse you, he had said, listen to the tone. She listened to herself now. Beneath the fear, beneath the calculation, beneath every reasonable argument for staying at the table's edge where she belonged, the tone was clear. She knew what she was going to do. She had known since the alcove. She straightened her vest. She steadied the decanter. She looked across the room at Paul Stan's hand, the tattoos, the pen, the contract beneath it, and she thought about silence and what it costs and who pays for it. Then she walked through the door. The room received her the way it always did, without acknowledgement, without interruption. The three men continued their business as she entered, each occupying his particular position in the careful geometry of the negotiation. Paul Stan at the center, pen in hand. Mr. Lee across from him, composed and waiting. Victor beside them both, polished and present. The indispensable bridge between two worlds that Nancy now understood he had spent the entire evening quietly burning. She moved to the wine station first. Not because she needed to. Because she needed a reason to cross the room that did not announce itself as anything other than service. Because she had learned, in 2 years on this floor, that the most effective way to move through a room full of powerful men was to give them no reason to watch you do it. She lifted the decanter. The burgundy wine caught the chandelier light as she tilted it deep red, nearly opaque, the color of something that cannot be taken back once it has been spilled. She noted the small, involuntary poetry of that and set it aside. This was not a moment for anything, except precision. She crossed to the table. Victor was speaking. His English came out in the same measured cadence she had been listening to all evening. Smooth, unhurried, calibrated to project competence and calm. He was translating something Mr. Lee had said moments earlier. Nancy did not catch all of it. She caught enough to know that whatever Mr. Lee had actually said bore little resemblance to the version arriving at Paul Stan's end of the conversation. She reached Paul Stan's side of the table. He did not look up. He was reading the final page of the contract, his pen resting between 2 fingers, his eyes moving slowly across the lines with the focused attention of a man conducting a final check before committing to something irreversible. The tattoos across his knuckles shifted as his grip adjusted. The watch at his wrist caught the light briefly. He was close. She could feel it in the quality of his stillness, the particular concentration of a man preparing to act. She began to pour. The wine moved into his glass in a thin, controlled arc. She kept her hand steady. She kept her expression composed. She kept her eyes on the glass because that was where a waitress's eyes belonged during this particular task. And she was a waitress. And this was simply a refill on an ordinary evening in a private dining suite where nothing unusual was occurring. Then she leaned slightly forward. Not dramatically. Not enough to draw Victor's eye or shift Mr. Lee's attention. Just the small, natural incline of a person ensuring the pour does not spill the kind of movement that happens 100 times an evening in rooms like this one and registers as nothing. Her voice came out barely above a breath, directed precisely at his ear, quiet enough that the words existed only in the 6 inches between her mouth and his head. Sir. A pause. 1 beat. Long enough for the word to land. Your translator is lying. Paul Stan did not react the way she had feared he might. He did not jerk back. He did not look up sharply. He did not produce any of the sudden, visible responses she had been bracing for during the entire walk across the room. The responses that would have drawn Victor's attention and collapsed whatever fragile window she had just opened. He went still. Not the stillness of surprise, something different, deeper. The stillness of a man whose entire system has just received a signal that overrides every other process and requires a moment to be fully integrated. She had seen that quality of stillness in him once before, early in her time at the Meridian, when a man at an adjacent table had said something she hadn't caught, and Paul Stan had simply stopped moving for 3 full seconds before responding. She had wondered then what it meant. She understood it now. It was the stillness of someone recalibrating, taking the new information and running it against everything that preceded it. Not reacting until the calculation was complete. His pen stopped. Halfway across the paper. The signature incomplete, barely begun. The first letter trailing off into nothing, as the hand that held it ceased its motion without drama or announcement. He did not look at her. He did not look at Victor. He looked at the contract. And Nancy straightened up, adjusted the decanter, and took one precise step back from the table, back into the role she had briefly, invisibly departed, and stood with her hands composed, and her face arranged, and her heart making more noise than she would have preferred. 3 seconds passed. They were among the longest seconds of her life. Victor had not noticed. He was completing his translation of something, his voice continuing its measured flow, his hands making one of the small accompanying gestures she had catalogued all evening. Mr. Lee was listening with his characteristic composed patience, his eyes on the space between the documents. Neither of them was watching Paul Stan's pen. Neither of them had heard. 4 seconds. Paul Stan's jaw moved. Barely. The muscle at the corner tightened once the single, involuntary tell of a man who has received something that his face has been instructed not to show. 5 seconds. He lifted his eyes from the contract. Not toward Nancy, not toward Victor directly, but into the middle distance, that unfocused point above the table, where a person looks when they are seeing something internal rather than external. He held that gaze for exactly 2 seconds, then he set the pen down. Not with emphasis, not with the sharp, decisive motion that would have signaled to everyone in the room that something had changed. He set it down the way you set something down when you have simply decided, quietly, that you are finished holding it for now. A small movement, barely perceptible, but final. Victor's voice continued for another few words, and then slowed, registering the silence where Paul Stan's response should have been. He looked at Paul Stan. Paul Stan looked back at him. The room did not change. The chandelier continued its warm, indifferent glow. The wine sat in the glass, untouched. The contract lay open on the table with its signature line blank and waiting. But something in the air had shifted invisible, irreversible the way the air shifts in the moment before weather arrives. Nancy stood at the table's edge and did not move. The silence held. Paul Stan did not accuse Victor. That was the first thing Nancy noticed, and it told her more about the man than anything she had observed across the entire evening. A lesser man, or a more reactive one, would have turned immediately, would have let the accusation surface in his eyes before his mind had finished processing it, would have given Victor the one thing a guilty man needs most in the moment of exposure warning. Paul Stan gave him nothing. He picked up his wine glass instead, lifted it slowly, with the unhurried ease of a man who has simply decided to pause and appreciate what is in front of him. He swirled the wine once, set it back down. Then he looked across the table at Mr. Lee with an expression of relaxed, collegial interest, the expression of a man who is enjoying the evening and sees no reason to rush its conclusion. Ask him, Paul Stan said to Victor, his voice carrying its usual measured authority, how he sees the first phase of the partnership operating. Practically speaking, the first 90 days, Victor translated. Mr. Lee responded. Nancy was at the side table now, occupying herself with the careful rearrangement of glassware that required no rearrangement. Close enough to hear, invisible enough to remain unquestioned, she listened to Mr. Lee's Mandarin. He spoke for approximately 20 seconds. His tone was specific, detailed, conditional, containing at least 2 distinct qualifications that carried the weight of hard boundaries rather than preferences. Victor translated in 11 seconds. He says the first phase should flow naturally from the agreement. He's relaxed about the timeline and trusts your judgment on the operational details. Nancy's hand paused on a glass stem. Mr. Lee had said nothing resembling that. He had outlined a specific 90-day framework with 2 non-negotiable checkpoints and a clause about reporting. The word he had used for the checkpoints was not relaxed. It was the same word her father had used when explaining why cargo manifests required sign-off at every port of transfer. Mandatory. Paul Stan nodded slowly. His face gave nothing away. Good, he said. And the reporting structure, how does he prefer to handle that? The test continued for 11 minutes. Nancy understood what she was watching approximately 4 questions in. Paul Stan was not asking about operational details. He was asking questions he already had some frame of reference for questions where Mr. Lee's answers, if accurately translated, would produce responses Paul Stan could cross-reference against his own knowledge of how Chinese shipping partnerships were conventionally structured. He was building a map, and he was checking Victor's translations against it. The 5th question was about liability allocation in cases of cargo loss. Nancy caught Mr. Lee's answer clearly firm, specific, assigning primary liability to the party responsible for the relevant leg of transport with no exceptions. Victor translated, He says liability is something they can work through together case by case. Very collaborative approach. Paul Stan's eyes moved to Mr. Lee's face. Mr. Lee was already watching him with an expression Nancy had not seen him wear before. Not confusion, exactly. Something more precise than that. The expression of a man who has just heard a response to his own words that does not correspond to anything he said, and is deciding whether to address it directly or wait and see whether the person across from him has noticed. He waited. Paul Stan asked another question. This time, Nancy watched Mr. Lee's reaction as Victor translated Paul Stan's English into Mandarin. Mr. Lee listened. A small line appeared between his brows, the involuntary response of someone processing words that do not quite match the conversation they believed they were having. He answered carefully, his tone measured in the particular way of someone who has begun to suspect that the room contains a variable he has not yet identified. He was not wrong. Paul Stan let the silence after Mr. Lee's answer sit for slightly longer than was comfortable. Then he said, without looking at Victor, "He seems uncertain about that." "Not at all," Victor said smoothly. "He's very confident, very aligned with your position." Paul Stan looked at Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee's expression was not confidence. It was not alignment. It was the careful, watchful neutrality of a man who has decided to become very still until he understands what is happening in this room. "Ask him," Paul Stan said, "what the penalty figure is, for a first-phase breach, specifically." Victor translated, or appeared to. Mr. Lee answered immediately, with the ease of a man reciting something he has reviewed many times. Nancy caught the number clearly. Her father had taught her numbers early, had drilled them at the kitchen table until she could produce them without thinking. It was not a small number. Victor translated it as approximately a third of what Mr. Lee had said. Paul Stan wrote something on the margin of the contract page. He looked at what he had written. He looked at the contract. He looked at Victor. Something shifted in the room. Not dramatically. Not with the sudden atmospheric violence of a confrontation arriving at full force. More like the moment when weather that has been building on the horizon finally reaches the ground. The change had been coming for some time. And now it was simply here. Paul Stan reached into the inner pocket of his jacket. He produced a phone, unlocked it with his thumb, navigated to something Nancy could not see what, and set it face up on the table beside the contract. Then he looked at Mr. Lee directly and spoke, not to Victor, to Mr. Lee, in Mandarin. It was not fluent. It was not the Mandarin of someone who had studied it formally or maintained it carefully. It was the Mandarin of someone who had picked up specific phrases across years of doing business with people who spoke it, functional, accented, limited in scope but precise in intention. He asked one question. Nancy understood it completely. "What number did you just give me?" The room went very quiet. Mr. Lee looked at Paul Stan for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes. Recognition, reassessment, the rapid recalculation of a man who is revising his understanding of every exchange that has occurred in this room across the past 2 hours. Then he answered, clearly, the same number he had given before. Victor said nothing. Paul Stan looked at what he had written in the margin. He looked at Victor's translation. He set the pen down on the table with a gentleness that was somehow more final than any dramatic gesture could have been. And then he turned and looked at Victor with the full, undivided attention of a man who has been patient for exactly long enough. "Those aren't the same number," he said. Victor's composure held for approximately 2 seconds. Then it began, almost imperceptibly, to come apart at the edges, the slight tightening around the eyes, the barely visible adjustment of weight from one foot to the other, the swallow that happened too quickly and too deliberately to be anything other than what it was. There may have been a slight Victor, one word, no inflection, no anger, which was, Nancy understood, considerably more frightening than anger would have been. Victor stopped speaking. Paul Stan looked at him the way you look at something you have been holding for a long time and have just decided to put down permanently. "Leave the room," he said. Victor left. He walked to the suite door with the measured pace of a man who is investing his remaining composure entirely in the quality of his exit. The door opened. The door closed. The sound of it was very small in the large room. The silence that followed was different from any silence that had preceded it. It was the silence of a room that has finished being one thing and has not yet decided what it will be next. Paul Stan sat with both hands flat on the table, looking at the contract. Mr. Lee sat across from him, still and watchful, his expression carrying the particular gravity of a man who understands that something significant has just occurred and is waiting to learn the full shape of it. Nancy stood at the side table. She had not moved in 4 minutes. Paul Stan did not look at her. But something in the angle of his stillness told her, with quiet certainty, that he knew exactly where she was. He picked up the phone from the table, made a call, spoke 3 sentences in a low voice she could not hear, set it back down. Then he looked at Mr. Lee and said, carefully, in the limited Mandarin he possessed, "I need someone who speaks the truth." Mr. Lee held his gaze for a moment. Then he nodded. Once. Slowly. With the expression of a man who has just decided that this evening is not over. It was the first moment of genuine communication that had occurred at this table all night. The man Paul Stan sent for arrived in 14 minutes. Nancy knew this because she had not left the suite. No one had asked her to, and she had not volunteered to go. And in the particular charged stillness that followed Victor's exit, the normal protocols of the evening had quietly suspended themselves. She stood at her station and was present, and no one told her otherwise. The replacement translator was a woman mid-40s, dark jacket, the brisk, efficient manner of someone called away from something else, and professional enough not to show the inconvenience. Paul Stan exchanged 3 sentences with her before she took Victor's former position between the 2 men. She looked at Mr. Lee. She introduced herself in Mandarin. Mr. Lee studied her for a moment. Then he nodded. Paul Stan placed his hands flat on the table and said, "From the beginning, ask him to walk us through his understanding of the key terms. Everything." What followed was the most difficult 11 minutes Nancy had experienced in the suite that evening, and the evening had not been short on difficulty. Mr. Lee spoke carefully, methodically, with the patient precision of a man reconstructing something that has been damaged and wants to ensure the reconstruction is accurate. The new translator rendered his words into English with clean, unadorned directness, no softening, no adjustment, no editorial smoothing of the kind that Nancy had been listening to all evening from Victor's end of the room. The contract terms emerged in their actual form. The financial penalties were not flexible. They were fixed at a figure nearly 3 times what Victor had translated automatic, non-negotiable, triggered by specific conditions that were written into the contract's secondary clauses in language that Paul Stan's legal team had not been provided accurate translations of during the preliminary review process. The liability structure was not collaborative. It assigned clear, specific obligations to Paul Stan's network across the first phase of the partnership, with consequences for non-compliance that compounded quarterly. The 90-day framework was not relaxed. It contained 2 mandatory reporting checkpoints with external audit requirements attached. None of this was hidden. None of it was unusual for a contract of this scale and complexity. Mr. Lee had brought it to the table openly, had stated its terms clearly throughout the evening, had Nancy understood now with complete certainty, attempted at least twice to emphasize the non-negotiable nature of specific clauses in terms that were entirely transparent. Victor had buried every one of them. Paul Stan listened to the accurate translations without interruption. His face was the same controlled mask it had been all evening. But Nancy, who had been watching him closely enough to catalog the small involuntary tells beneath the mask, saw the moment the full picture assembled itself behind his eyes, the barely perceptible stillness that deepened into something more absolute, the slight adjustment of his jaw. He had trusted Victor for 6 years. She did not know the full history of that trust, how it had been built, what rooms it had been carried into, what decisions had been made on the basis of it. She did not need to know. She could see the weight of it in the quality of his silence as the accurate terms replaced the false ones, piece by piece, and the shape of what had been done to him became undeniable. When Mr. Lee finished, the new translator folded her hands and waited. Paul Stan said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "Ask him if he knew." The question was translated. Mr. Lee's response was immediate, his tone carrying the unambiguous quality of a man who has anticipated this question and prepared for it. "He says no," the translator said. "He says his understanding was that both parties were receiving accurate information. He says he became concerned during the negotiation that some of his statements were not producing the expected responses. He assumed a communication difficulty. He did not assume deliberate manipulation." Paul Stan absorbed this. "Ask him if he still wants the partnership." Another translation. A longer response from Mr. Lee measured, careful, containing what the translator rendered as, "He says the terms he brought to this table are genuine. The partnership he proposed is genuine. What happened tonight was not his design. He says he would like the opportunity to begin the conversation honestly." Paul Stan looked at the contract. He picked it up. For one suspended moment, Nancy thought he was going to sign it, that the evening would resolve itself with the pragmatic efficiency of powerful men who have identified the problem, removed it, and returned to business. Instead, he folded it once and set it aside. "Tell him we'll talk again," he said. Not tonight. Mr. Lee received this and nodded with the composed dignity of a man who understands that this is not a refusal, but a reset, and that a reset, given what had occurred, is a reasonable and even respectful response. Then Paul Stan did something Nancy had not anticipated. He stood up. Not to leave. He was still in the room, still present, still the largest force in a space that contained several significant forces. But he stood, which changed the geometry of everything, and he turned not toward the door Victor had exited through, not toward Mr. Lee, not toward the new translator, toward Nancy. She did not move. She kept her hands composed and her expression neutral, and looked back at him with the steady professional stillness she had spent 2 years perfecting, and had drawn on more heavily tonight than in all the preceding months combined. He looked at her for a moment that felt considerably longer than its actual duration. You understood what he was saying, Paul Stan said. It was not a question. Some of it, Nancy said. Not all. Enough. Enough, she agreed. He studied her with the focused attention of a man recalibrating something fundamental. Not just the evening, not just the contract, but some deeper calculation she did not have full access to. How? He said. My father, she said. He worked cargo logistics in Shanghai. 11 years. Paul Stan was quiet for a moment. He taught you. Fragments, she said. Tone, mostly. He always said tone was the truth. Something moved briefly across Paul Stan's face. Not softness, exactly. Something more austere than that. The particular expression of a man who has encountered something that has earned his acknowledgement without requiring his warmth. He nodded once. Your father was right, he said. He made 2 more calls after that. Brief, low, conducted near the window while Mr. Lee and the new translator spoke quietly at the table. Nancy understood, from the tone of both calls, that Victor's evening was not going to continue in any comfortable direction. She did not allow herself to feel anything particular about that. She had warned a man. What followed belonged to a world that was not hers to judge. When Paul Stan returned to the table, he spoke to Mr. Lee for several minutes through the new translator, not about the contract, but about the framework of a future conversation, the mechanics of trust, carefully rebuilt from its actual foundations, rather than the false ones Victor had constructed. Mr. Lee listened, responded. The exchange had a different quality from everything that had preceded it. Slower, more careful, real in the way that things are real when the performance surrounding them has finally been removed. Nancy began the quiet work of clearing the table. Her hands were steady. They had been steady all evening. She was, she realized, going to be all right. The suite emptied gradually. The way rooms empty when the business conducted in them has reached its natural conclusion, not all at once, but in a sequence that follows the resolution of tension the way air follows an open door. Mr. Lee departed first. He stood, buttoned his jacket, and exchanged a final exchange with Paul Stan through the new translator, brief, formal, carrying the particular quality of 2 men who have agreed to meet again under better conditions and mean it. At the door he paused, turned back, looked across the room at Nancy with an expression she had not expected. Not gratitude, exactly, because he did not fully know what she had done, but something adjacent to it. Recognition, perhaps. The acknowledgement of a man who understands that the evening's outcome was not entirely the result of the forces he had observed directly. He inclined his head toward her. A small, precise gesture. Then he was gone. The new translator followed, exchanging a few final words with Paul Stan that Nancy did not try to catch. The door closed behind her with the soft, definitive sound of an evening moving into its final phase. The suite held 2 people now. Paul Stan stood beside the table, his jacket still on, his hands at his sides. The folded contract sat where he had placed it, set aside, not discarded, with the deliberate neutrality of something that might yet have a future in a different form. The chandelier continued its indifferent warmth above the polished wood and empty glasses and white plates that had held an entire evening's worth of conversation and concealment. Nancy cleared the last of the glassware onto the service tray. She was nearly finished. Another 4 minutes and the suite would be ready for the close of evening inspection, and she would return the tray to the kitchen and collect her things and walk the 12 minutes home and check that her mother was settled and then sit somewhere quiet and let the evening decompress from the inside out, which she anticipated would take considerably longer than 12 minutes. She was lifting the tray when Paul Stan spoke. How long did you know? His voice was the same as it had been all evening, measured, carrying its own particular gravity. Not loud, but not requiring volume to be heard clearly in any room it occupied. Nancy set the tray back down. She considered the question carefully, because it deserved a careful answer. I wasn't certain, she said. Not for most of it. I heard things that didn't match. I kept telling myself my Mandarin wasn't strong enough to be sure, but you were sure enough. Eventually, she said, when he took the phone call. Paul Stan was quiet for a moment. You heard that? Fragments. The same as the rest of it. She paused, enough to understand the direction. He looked at her with that same quality of focused attention he had turned on her after the confrontation, the look of a man conducting an assessment that goes beyond the surface of what is visible. You could have said nothing, he said. Yes, Nancy said. Most people would have. She did not answer that immediately. She thought about the corridor, the bench, the folded piece of paper with the reference number. She thought about her father at the kitchen table, patient and unhurried, tapping the surface once with one finger when he wanted her to understand that what followed was important. I owed you, she said finally. You know that. Paul Stan's expression shifted not dramatically, but perceptibly. The particular shift of a man who has been acknowledged for something he had not expected to be acknowledged for. He looked briefly away from her, toward the window, with an expression she could not fully read but recognized as the expression of someone who is deciding how to occupy an unexpected moment. That was 2 years ago, he said. It doesn't expire, Nancy said simply. He was quiet for long enough that the room settled around the silence comfortably. Outside the suite, the distant sounds of the Meridian's main floor continued their ordinary rhythm, the soft percussion of an evening winding down, glasses and laughter, and the low music of a restaurant that did not know and would never know what had occurred in this room tonight. Paul Stan moved to the window, stood with his back partially to her, looking out at the city beyond the glass, the lights, the darkness between them, the particular nighttime geography of a place that continues its life, regardless of what happens in any single room within it. Your father, he said. The logistics work in Shanghai. 11 years, Nancy said. He came back when I was 4, kept the language, passed pieces of it to me. He sounds like a careful man. He was, she said. He believed that understanding language meant understanding people, that you couldn't really separate them. Paul Stan absorbed this. He was right about that too, he said quietly. Nancy picked up the tray again. Her hands were steady, had been steady all evening, through everything the evening had contained. And she was grateful for that, in the way you are grateful for the things in yourself that hold when holding is required. The partnership, she said, with Mr. Lee. Will you pursue it? Paul Stan turned from the window, looked at the folded contract on the table. Something in his expression carried the weight of a man who is recalculating not just the evening but the longer arc of decisions that had brought him to it. The trust placed, the trust broken, the particular cost of discovering that the bridge you have crossed without question for years was never fully sound. The terms are legitimate, he said. The deal is sound. A pause. Victor was the problem, not the partnership. Then it survives, Nancy said. Most things do, Paul Stan said. If you catch them in time. She was at the door when he spoke again. Nancy. She stopped, turned. He was standing beside the table, one hand resting on the folded contract, looking across the room at her with an expression that contained more than she could easily inventory: acknowledgement, reassessment, the particular gravity of a man who does not easily admit that he needed something he did not know he needed. What your father taught you, he said. It mattered tonight. Nancy held his gaze across the length of the room. I know, she said. She pushed through the door. The corridor outside was bright and ordinary, and smelled like the kitchen and the close of a long shift. She walked it the way she always walked it, steadily, without announcement, and collected her jacket and her bag and said goodnight to the colleague who was still finishing the late cleanup, and walked out into the night air that hit her face with the particular clarity of something real, after hours of something that had required enormous effort to navigate. She walked the 12 minutes home. Her mother's light was still on. She stood outside the building for a moment, and looked up at the lit window, and thought about a hospital corridor, and a folded piece of paper, and a man who had made a phone call and never mentioned it. And she thought about her father at a kitchen table teaching her a language one fragment at a time, patient and unhurried, believing it mattered without knowing why. It had mattered tonight. Sometimes the truth does not come from translators or contracts, or the powerful men who build empires on the precise meaning of words. Sometimes it comes from someone standing at the edge of the table close enough to hear, invisible enough to be underestimated, carrying a dead man's language in her chest like a compass that only works when everything else in the room has stopped pointing true north. Nancy Moore had not been fluent enough to translate, but she had been present enough to listen. And sometimes that is the only thing between a man and the lie designed to destroy him. She pushed open the door and went upstairs to her mother. The city continued behind her, indifferent and luminous, full of rooms where deals were being made in languages that did not always survive the crossing. But in one room, tonight, the truth had. Thanks for sticking with this story until the very end. You're the reason these stories feel alive. If you're ready for another powerful journey, just tap the next video on your screen. And before you go, leave a quick comment and rate this story from 1 to 10. I'm excited to read your thoughts and connect with you in the comments.